been talking about division. I've been thinking a lot about this, especially when we're talking about war and so on. Women's resistance. I was talking with Haifa earlier. She wrote an article about resistance in Baghdad with the poetry and songs and so on. There are a Palestinian, Rima Tarazi and what's her name? Tanya Nasser, who've written some wonderful children's songs. I mean, they're not all children's songs, but some of them are children's songs. My grandchildren love them. That are really a form of resistance. I mean, they're very Palestinian. They're extremely, I mean, they're very melodious, and they're lots of fun and very human and so on. Okay, that's an obvious form of resistance. But when I write in my memoir of Beirut Fragments, my memoir of the Lebanese War, and I say when the Israelis came in 1982, I was just sitting in my house, refusing to go out because they told me I should, and they dropped these leaflets. This is one of the Israelis' lovely habits. They send a plane over your head, and they drop these leaflets that are very pretty, and sort of you're looking at them thinking, oh. And actually what they're saying is, get out, because we're going to bomb the hell out of this place. And if, you know, so this is their conscience working. This is why they call themselves the most moral army. And in 1982 they did this, and I was ferociously angry about this. I wrote about this in my trajectory because I had actually no role to play. I had absolutely no role to play except to say I'm just not going. And I thought to myself at the time, very consciously, is this a form of resistance to just exist, to just be here, to just sit here? Is that what we mean by women's resistance? Because in a way, I think that is what we mean by women's. Of course, there are women who actually fight and shoot. And that brings me to another big problem, a huge problem that I'm having these days, which is the business of violence and non-violence. I like to believe that I believe in non-violence. I declared myself at one point to be a pacifist, saying that war is so unfair in its mechanism that you have to be, you can't believe in war. You can't say a war is just if it's as unjust as war is. You know, I mean, a bomb might fall right now, and la samah Allah, you know, some of us might be killed, some of us might be mutilated, and some of us might be just perfectly okay and walk away. So it's so unfair and so you say to yourself, okay, it's so unfair that it can't be just, therefore I don't believe in war, just or unjust or any kind. On the other hand, we have a problem in the world, and especially in our part of the world. You have a problem that is that international law, to which one normally turns and says, okay, international law, please, where are you? Well, where is it? National leadership in our part of the world, one country after another, corruption and hypocrisy and, I mean, power and violence and political prisoners and. So what is one to do? I mean, if you don't believe in violence, and you do believe in non-violence, and non-violence has proved to be so entirely useless. The International Court of Justice has ruled against the wall. So what? Now the Goldstone report, we were talking about it at lunch, has come out. So what? There are a million reports before that. So what? Everybody knows the story, everybody knows the statistics, and nothing happens. So how can you any longer say you don't believe in war? Okay, what do you believe in? I ask myself. Okay, what do you want to happen? So this is another problem I'm dealing with at the moment. Another problem is that when we talk about women as victims, and we seem to do that a lot, and even today I heard a lot of that, and I agree with it. It's not that I don't. In wartime, women are victims. Okay, but aren't men? I mean, in Gaza, for instance, in January, there were lots of men were killed. I mean, there were fathers too. I saw them, you know, carrying their dead babies and things. And well, I mean, why should I feel more sorry for the women than for the men? I'm not sure about that at all.
I have no actually problem whatsoever about the armed resistance. On the contrary, I think the armed resistance, and I agree by the United Nations resolution, it's been worked for the Palestinians, people of occupied countries entitled, legally, morally, ethically, anything you think of it, to resist by all means, inclusive the armed resistance. Because, I mean, after all, I mean, you put it in a clear picture. What do we do? Peace, women's rights, feminism, all these are noble aims which we always fought for, but it's being used against us.
I've had to summon up a lot of courage to ask this question, but I will ask it. Haifa, you said this, and Helen also brought up a similar point. It was disturbing to hear you say that in terms of defense, that violent resistance is valid, and that you feel supportive of it, right?
The difference between your world and ours, I think, is that we are living, I mean, the stories Nadia was telling, as opposed to the stories you were telling, which are also mind-boggling, but is that we're dealing with direct colonialisms in a form, after the rest of the world has moved on from colonialism. So you've got different forms, maybe internalized, maybe the armies now acting as state security is one thing that we also have, by the way. We have both. Thank the heavens, being a privileged people.
They very often have been, in terms of a very radical challenge issued, at least to the kind of logic that the state perpetuates. I mean, if you think about the non-violence movement in the Indian context, I'm not eulogizing Gandhi. I have major critiques of Gandhi myself. But I'm saying that the basic point there was a very, very radical critique of the logic of the state. It was a politics that was located in a completely different sphere that was outside the framework of the logic of the colonial state. And that is what I think enabled this movement to succeed, to pull the rug off from beneath the colonial forces and actually prove to be effective in some ways. So I'm saying that one was, what did it mean for you personally to come to take up this stand? And two is that when you say it so categorically, what does it mean in terms of that hope that we still have of being able to conceptualize something? Maybe people who are not involved in direct, and who does that? Because those who are involved in the direct firefighting or in the direct throes of the movement don't have that kind of leisure for philosophical thinking about it. But at the same time, they are the ones who have the wherewithal to think about it because of their historical experiences. So where does this leave us in terms of that involved the wisdom of activism feeding into the wisdom of philosophy?
But does that position of taking that very categorical position on violence and defense, for your defense you use violence against the state, does that in any manner interfere with how we conceptualize what kind of an ideal state?
What I'm asking is not that. What I'm asking is that when you say it so categorically, when you're defending the right of resistance fighters to use violence so categorically, what does it mean for the other possibilities of conceptualization?
I'm going to explode if I don't say something.
My
May
2
I-
minutes.
Sorry,
No, it's okay.
it'll take 30
It's
seconds.
yeah.
If you're living in Lebanon in 2006 and the Israelis are bombing the hell out of you, and then you hear that Hezbollah has bombed something in Israel, what are you to say? No, they're naughty boys, they're being violent, I mean, there's a problem. Or we are watching the Palestinians being bombed the hell out of in Gaza. And you hear that a Katyusha has got a homemade rocket made of steel, and they use these things for the cars, whatever they're called. And they chuck a rocket across, and the whole world is weeping for the poor children who have to go to a shelter, while hundreds of our children, and we're watching them all day long, are being bombed. You get to the point where you ask yourself, I mean, yeah, you say bravo for throwing a bomb or doing whatever it is. Because, I mean, it's so emotional, it's so overwhelming. Sorry.
When I go to Kashmir, I'm still seen as an outsider because of what Kashmiris believe is an occupation by the Indian army, Indian state. Now the point for me was, as an activist from the women's movement, how is it that we did not actually leave alone documenting women's voices or their struggles, because you have been in political, social, economic rights. So it is an agitational struggle, it is negotiations, it's being out on the street. But here it's a complete zero, and here it's complete silence. So to me, the only two things that come to mind is, one is the whole paradigm of national security and human security. Two is we have these two very long history, Northeast, as Mubashi mentioned, and Kashmir. Kashmir actually now has become so complicated also because of the two countries, India and Pakistan, and the whole question of terrorism. It's a Muslim majority state, and every Kashmiri is a suspect until he, more than women, proves to be innocent. So for the women's movement, I think the biggest question is to address this fearlessly. Because if you take a position, you could be called anti-national, and you cannot resolve it as women by saying, okay, we believe that this is the struggle and we should be part of it. Of course, we can do that. But then, what position do you take? So if you're fearless as women activists and say we want to extend our support and solidarity and be with you in your struggle, only then I think that paradigm could also shift a little and bring it to the national agenda, which we have failed to do as women as activists. That was one of the points. And secondly, I think what you mentioned as why is it that we only talk about women as victims? And immediately that came to mind about Kashmir, because the way men suffer, the way men are vulnerable, because that is how it begins quite often, that women become indirectly the victims, because men have directly become victims of the kind of violence that the state uses. Because once the state intrudes your home to pick up the men for search and cordon operations, the women of course become victims, but it's the men who are first in line. So in Kashmir, it's interesting how women actually become protectors, how women become providers, and they take care that men are not taken away. And once they are taken away, it's women who are out in their struggle to bring back the men who may be alive or those who are not dead.